All right, welcome to the week 5 video. Can't believe we're already that far into the quarter. Um, First thing I'm going to say a little bit about the reading for next week. There's no reading from the Lou book. I will ask you to read chapter 7 from Roy on the political history. And so this chapter 7 is on period under President Lee Teng-hui from the late 80s into the 90s. Again, it's more of a political narrative, but there is one part that's pretty relevant to the film we're going to watch. Lee Teng-hui is the first Taiwanese president of Taiwan, handpicked pretty much, essentially handpicked by Jiang Jingguo, who was the son of Chiang Kai-shek, served as president for about 10 years, died in 88. And this is part of his contribution then to democracy, to his understanding that that KMT could only survive with Taiwanese leaders, at least not exclusively Taiwanese leaders, but some really healthy amount of Taiwanese leadership. The part of the chapter that's maybe most relevant to the film we're going to watch is on organized crime under the KMT. And it becomes really interesting. It's an interesting paradox, I think, of the democratization of Taiwan, that as party politics became more the way things went and there's more opposition, there was more of a reason to cultivate ties between the KMT and gangs, and that these gangs became another way for the KMT to make money to keep themselves in power. So that's kind of a paradox, I guess, of the democratization era that we'll be reading about. So the reading actually takes us a little bit ahead of where we are in the film. Again, the film is made in the late 80s. But again, I think it's still good to get that political narrative and to have that kind of grounding as we go. But the film is The Terrorizers. So as we watch the film, we'll get to understand this image pretty well. It's again, I think it's really stunning, and I don't want to wreck it for you. But this is the first film that I think, yeah, for sure the first film that I will have to give you a trigger warning on. And that's simply to say that there are a couple, call it 3 pretty violent scenes in the film. And I know you're all grown up and you've all seen everything before, but I feel like we've all been through a lot the last year, and if it makes it easier for me to say this for any number of you, then that's why I'm doing it. So at the point where you see the doctor talking about his promotion to his policeman friend, that's when you will start to expect some pretty serious violence. It's stunning in the film. I don't want to say too much more about it. It's part of what makes the film really shocking. I think it makes it's really memorable. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that so it doesn't upset people unduly. The woman that we see in this photo, so the film starts actually with the 2 of these people. This guy here is a young photographer, and he sees a drug bust happening, and he just wants to take some pictures. He's this kind of we'll see that he's a young kind of ne'er-do-well, really rich family. He just wants to hang out and take pictures, and he sees that this young woman is involved, and he takes pictures of her. Just so you know, so it's not confusing, she will be called in the film a couple times, I think in the translation we're watching, the foreign chick, I think is how they call her. This part's interesting. So in the reading, I think both the articles that we're reading about the film must have been using obviously we're using an older, maybe American release or something, a Western release, and they're using the phrase white chick. But I'm pretty sure in our version they're calling her a foreign chick, but she's biracial, and so that'll be an interesting part of it. We'll see her mother as someone that we'll come to understand had a lot of interaction with American soldiers at that time when the American military was stationed in Taiwan. So again, just for our perspective, there was a pretty pretty significant American military presence in Taiwan all the way up to the very end of 1978. And on the night of December 31st, 1978, they leave. January 1st, 1979 is when relations end with the ROC, begin with the PRC. And one of the conditions for that is that the US has to remove all its forces from Taiwan. And so if this young woman is 18 or 19 or 20 or something, then that puts it, it's obviously squarely in that time during the Vietnam War, when a lot of American soldiers would come to Taiwan for R&R, as they called it. And so we'll come to understand that this young woman's mother had those kind of interactions with American soldiers. I think we'll want to think about, this is another one of the films where male directors really take on ideas of women's fate or women's condition in modern society. So this director is Edward Yang. He was born in China in 1947. His family came as one of these mainlander families, educated in the US. He's also part of this Taiwan New Cinema. He's one of the 3 main directors that are most responsible for that new cinema, which is simply just defined as new, expressive, original ways of talking about the lives of people in Taiwan. He was really interested in Taipei, so his films are all in an urban setting. Ho, as we saw, we'll see an urban film by him later, but obviously he felt very comfortable talking about the lives of people in the countryside. But Yang, all his films are about Taipei. One of the articles you read by Chang mentioned he devotes his career to portraying the impact of neoliberal capitalism on the lives of the citizens of Taipei. And as this author goes on, Yang's films often employ female perspectives to criticize Taiwan's education system and transnational corporations for perpetuating neoliberal capitalism's ideology of self-fulfillment and upward mobility. And so this is a really square-on kind of description of the Terrorizers, that it's about, again, we're well into the economic miracle. We're into this real triumphalist moment in the history of Taiwan, where there's great wealth. And so many of the characters we see are these yuppies. They're striving, they're moving up. But then we see these young people as well that represent a different kind of isolation and alienation. And so the thing about these yuppies that we'll also see is we'll get a very good sense of their isolation in their striving and moving forward. So there's a couple of articles that I'm kind of going back and forth between the articles and the film. The Chang article that you'll read about the film is pretty straightforward. That author looks at a couple of different Yang films, but don't worry about the other ones, obviously. But that author talks about the idea in the Terrorizers of the game or puzzle of chance relations as one of the concerns of the film. This author talks about women's voices, and this young woman that we see in this photo here, she gets hurt when she's trying to escape from the drug bust that I mentioned, and when she gets home, she has to spend some time at home, and in her boredom at home, as she's recovering from her injuries, she starts making crank calls, and she starts making some really vicious crank calls. And one of the crank calls that she makes is to another one of our main characters, a female novelist, and that sets things in motion. And so one of the ideas in this film is that of women's voices, literally in this case, women's voices setting each other free. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, this female perspective, but obviously we're talking about male directors thinking about women's perspectives. And so I think that's always a rich thing that we can talk about. How do they do? I thought we had a great discussion at the very end of class on Dust in the Wind, and just the idea of was Hun, did she want to be in the city? What was the nature of how she saw Wan? And I think we got to some really interesting things about how Juan looked at her and treated her. And so I think that we would all agree that that was a pretty effective demonstration of a male director who's able to at least, kind of understand those things about women's experiences. We can obviously go further and say, what does he get wrong about that perspective? But I think this will also allow us to enter into the same kind of discussions. The other article that I've asked you to read is by Frederick Jameson, called Remapping Taipei. It might be it's got to be the most famous article about a Taiwanese film. So that's why it's on the syllabus. It's also super duper complicated. I've tried many times with this article over the last 30 years. Still don't get it really. So, but the reason I put it on the syllabus and I'm asking you to spend some time with it is at least to think about the things he says about this film, because the problem with the article or chapter from a book actually is that it goes back and forth between this film and a bunch of other films from France and things. I don't think I've ever seen a single one of the other films he's talking about. So it's kind of useless for me in a way, but he does have some interesting ideas about, again, the nature of this film as he calls it, a postmodernist film par excellence. And so he's really interested in, again, that idea of modernization and the toll it takes on its psychic subjects. And he talks about the cold and glossy surface that we see in Taipei. He talks about the apartments that we see. He refers to this anthology of apartments and balconies that we'll see. Many of them really dingy, many of them really depressing. This is the same Taipei that our friend the chef lives in. We talked about how he lives in one of those old, nice Japanese houses, but these are the apartments that were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s. That, quite frankly, some of them just look, they're really alienating. And one interesting theory I'd never thought of in one of the articles on this film is that the boxes in this mosaic behind us, behind me, sorry, actually mimic the boxes that we see when we see a lot of shots of apartment buildings and people in these kind of dingy apartments and dingy balconies. And so it thinks about modern life, not in such like a class way that we saw in Dust in the Wind, but definitely on this idea of alienation, atomization. So Jameson also wants to look at women's destiny and their imprisonment. He talks about the waiting. He sees a lot of the characters in this film that are just kind of waiting for the next step, dull, dead. They're living in this modern city where there's all these conveniences, but somehow really torn apart from some kind of society that came before. Anonymity is something that's on Jameson's mind. So anyway, so when you spend some time with the Jameson article, don't worry about like the hard parts, I would say, because some of it's really complicated. But when you see him talking about this film, pay some attention to that, because I think he has some pretty useful ideas. He talks about it as a third world film, which is very distracting. He has his own definition in a way of third world. He says it's not an economic definition. It's a description of Taiwan being not communist and not closely allied with, say, Europe, the US, and Japan. So therefore he calls it the third world, which is kind of weird. And it's also really weird because Taiwan is definitely closely allied with the US and Japan. So the article has a lot of problems, but he's a very famous theorist. And so the fact that he took this whole chapter to look at this film is a pretty significant moment in the history of Taiwan cinema's acceptance around the world. And so finally, Jameson's really interested in the art versus life, the novel and reality. So again, I mentioned one of the characters is a novelist, and we'll see her writing a novel about life. And so when we see this photographer, looking at things through his camera. So there's a lot of interplay like that, what's just the contradictions between art and life, between novel and reality, pictures of a picture like this. There's a lot of things like that going on. Telephones are all over the place. And so maybe that's something to try to figure out what's the significance of telephones. In Dust in the Wind, we saw watches and clocks and trains as these really important symbols of modernity. And the telephone here is also doing something for what Yang wants to talk about in terms of this modern society that is, again, really ripping people out of older, older forms. So I think that's probably the main thing I would say, main introduction I would give to the film. I mentioned that it's also challenging. I think this one will be easier to follow. I think more happens, but there are these moments in the film where we kind of have to make some guesses as to what's happened between different scenes. A lot of scenes where people don't really say much and kind of have to figure out, why they're making these choices. So I think it's, challenging in that way, but I think it's also pretty compelling. And so there's one more kind of dramatic thing going on, which is one of the characters we'll see who was married to the novelist is a doctor who wants a promotion, and so we see him throw a friend under the bus to try to get a promotion. So that's another thing. There's a few main characters like that, and they have these. There is a plot that's going on that's more recognizable than Dust in the Wind. So I think it'll kind of keep people's attention pretty well, even if it has some really jarring kinds of shots and a lot of repetition and these kind of silent moments. I'll be showing it Friday 2 to 4, and I really look forward to getting into this one on Monday with you all. So enjoy the film, and I'll see you on Monday. Bye.